The wind howled across the barren landscape of Gorvaxis, 9, sweeping loose ash into swirling, ghostly shapes that danced in the flickering light of a bonfire. It was a cold night, sharp with the bite of old war, the kind that settled deep into bones and reminded warriors of those who had died on fields like these. But for the young recruits of the Dravari Legion, there was no reflection, no weight of memory, only laughter and the easy arrogance of those untouched by real battle. They sat in a loose circle, their scaled, muscular forms hunched toward the warmth, tongues flicking in amusement as they spoke. The firelight gleamed off ceremonial chest plates, casting jagged shadows behind them, making them appear even taller than they were. They spoke of war, of conquest, of the weakness of lesser species. Humans, scoffed Zilvas, a lean, broad-shouldered Dravari whose ridged forehead creased in exaggerated disgust. He tossed a sharp-edged stone into the fire, watching it sizzle and blacken in the embers. I've heard tales of them, pathetic things. Soft, fleshy, breakable. A few others chuckled, nodding in agreement. I don't see why our elders treat them with such caution, Rikton added, stretching his long limbs lazily. His talons scraped against the rock beneath him. They die so easily. No claws, no natural armor. They fight with fragile sticks and explosions, as if fire can match true warriors. I heard, said another, lowering his voice mockingly, that they fear the dark. That's why they need so many lights on their ships. Weak creatures. The recruits erupted into more laughter, their voices rising with the crackling flames. They were young. They had never faced humans, and so they could mock freely. A heavy thump silenced them. The laughter died instantly as every head turned toward the figure standing just outside the firelight. His shadow loomed over them, stretched long and ominous by the flickering glow. Captain Darvek, a veteran of too many battles. He moved with the deliberate slowness of one who had nothing left to prove. His armor was old, worn, and battle-scarred. The insignia on his shoulder faded but still unmistakable. His dark, reptilian eyes flicked over them, his gaze unreadable. Without a word, he stepped forward, unfastened his ancient rifle, and dropped it heavily onto the ground beside the fire. The metal clinked against stone, an almost ceremonial gesture, as if declaring he would need no weapon here. Silence held the air tight. Then he spoke. "You children," he said, his voice low, gravelly with years of war, "know nothing about war, and even less about humans." Zilvas shifted, uneasy. Rikton's mouth opened as if to argue, but something about the way Darvek stared into the fire stopped him. The captain's eyes weren't focused on them anymore. They were watching the flames as though they held something only he could see. "They are weak," Zilvas muttered after a long pause, but his voice had lost some of its bite. Darvek let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "That's what I thought once, too." His claws tapped absently against the metal of his knee guard. "Until I met one." The recruits were listening now, though they wouldn't admit it. Darvek exhaled slowly. "Let me tell you a story," he said. His tone was measured, as if weighing each word before releasing it. The flames shifted, crackling with renewed vigor, licking at the darkness. The cold pressed closer, and then he began. "When I was young, about your age, I fought in my first war," Darvek said, his voice steady, measured. "Not some training skirmish, not some simulated fight, a real war, where I watched men die and smelled the blood in the dirt. The recruits didn't move. They barely breathed. I was stationed on Vasker 7, a nothing world, a place of dirt and stone, a battlefield that should have been ours without question. We thought we were facing a small human resistance force. We were wrong." The firelight flickered strangely, casting deeper shadows across Darvek's scarred face. "We stormed their position expecting a slaughter," he continued, his voice tightening. "They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped. We should have wiped them out in an hour." A long pause. "But they didn't run. They didn't beg. They didn't even hesitate." Something cold settled into the recruits. Zilvas clenched his jaw, his confidence faltering. "I saw a human," Darvek murmured, as if saying the name of a ghost. His name was Commander Nathan Cole. The name meant nothing to them, but the way Darvek spoke it, the reverence buried beneath the words, made them lean in closer. He was already wounded when we arrived, bloodied, limping. His squad was nearly wiped out. And yet, when we breached their last line of defense, when we surrounded them with no escape, he didn't surrender. Darvek's claws curled into a fist. He charged us. A hiss of disbelief rippled through the recruits. Not away, not toward cover, straight at us. Darvek's eyes burned with something they couldn't place. We had plasma rifles. He had a knife. A murmur of unease ran through the group. He cut through 2 of my men before we even registered what was happening. He fought like an animal with nothing left to lose. No armor, no shields, just his rage and his will. I saw him take a plasma bolt to the chest and keep going. Another horrified silence. And before we brought him down, Darvek murmured, before he finally fell, he smiled. The words hung in the air like a weight none of them could lift. "I have never forgotten that smile," he continued. "I see it every time I close my eyes, because it was not the smile of a man who had lost." Darvek's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper now. It was the smile of a man who had already won. Zilvas swallowed, his throat dry. The fire crackled, and suddenly it didn't feel warm anymore. "Do you understand now?" Darvek asked quietly, his gaze sweeping over them. No one answered. He leaned forward slightly, his massive form casting long, jagged shadows across the younger warriors. "You mock humans because you think they are weak. But weakness does not carve battlefields into history. Weakness does not make warriors charge into death smiling." His voice was soft, but the weight of truth behind it made it feel heavier than any warhammer. "You think humans are prey," Darvek said. His next word sent a chill through the air. "But tell me, recruits, have you ever asked why they're the ones still standing?" The fire popped. No one spoke. The wind howled, whispering through the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The fire burned lower, its embers pulsing with a dim, steady glow as the night grew colder. The young Dravari soldiers sat motionless, their once-eager expressions dulled by the weight of Captain Darvek's words. Gone was the laughter, the smug certainty, the easy dismissal of humanity. The firelight danced across their dark, scaled faces, casting flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with the gravity of the story they had just begun to hear. Darvek let the silence linger. It was a heavy thing, a deliberate pause that pressed into them, forcing them to sit with the truth they had so easily scoffed at moments before. He wasn't in a hurry. The lessons worth learning were the ones that settled deep, the ones that forced reflection. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, slower, but no less commanding. "You don't truly understand what it means to fight humans," he said. "Not yet." Zilvas shifted where he sat, his earlier arrogance now a barely flickering ember. "Tell us then," he said, voice rough with something unspoken. "What makes them so dangerous?" Darvek exhaled, his breath curling into the frigid air. His clawed fingers flexed over his knee, as if feeling something long past. When he spoke, his voice carried the distant weight of memory. "The first time I saw them fight, I thought it was a mistake. I thought no species would choose to fight like that." He shook his head, as if still trying to make sense of it. "We believed the war on Vasker 7 would be over in a matter of days. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, with no reinforcements. It should have been a simple eradication." The fire crackled, the sound sharp in the cold. It wasn't. The recruits leaned in, drawn despite themselves. "We came at them with everything. Gunships rained down fire, orbital cannons tore through their strongholds, and our forces swept across their last position like a storm. We should have broken them." Darvek's fingers curled into a fist. "But the humans, they don't break." His gaze flicked to the young warriors before him, measuring their reactions. Their defenses fell, one by one, and still they fought. No retreat, no surrender. They fought as though death was a mere inconvenience. I watched wounded soldiers drag themselves through the mud, still firing. I saw a man missing half his arm refuse to go down until he had emptied his last magazine. And when they had no weapons left, when they were bleeding out in the dirt, they still lunged at us with their bare hands. A ripple of discomfort passed through the recruits. Even Dravari warriors, who were bred for war, trained from birth to embrace battle, knew when to accept death. But the picture Darvek painted was something else entirely, something unnatural. That should have been enough, he murmured, his eyes dark. But it wasn't, because humans don't just fight with bodies. They fight with their minds. He let the words sink in before continuing. We didn't understand at first. We thought they were disorganized, chaotic. We didn't see the patterns and the madness. Then our patrols started disappearing. Our supply lines were cut. Our equipment, our own weapons, were used against us. Every time we pushed forward, we were suddenly fighting in a place of their choosing. Every inch we took cost too much. His voice tightened, and the fire seemed to burn lower, as if mirroring the dark memories playing behind his eyes. They set traps in places no sane soldier would. They didn't fight for ground. They fought for time. And time was something they knew how to use. They buried explosives in their own fallen, knowing we'd search the bodies for intelligence. They set lures. Wounded men left to moan in the open, drawing our medics out just to gun them down. They learned our tactics, adapted faster than any species I've ever seen. A gust of wind swept across the camp, momentarily sending a flurry of embers spiraling into the night. I led an assault on a ruined city once, thinking we had them cornered, thought we had the numbers to finally finish them. His jaw tightened. We were wrong. Zilvas swallowed, his throat dry. What happened? Darvek's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. They let us take it. They let us walk right in, take position, settle into our victory. We didn't realize that they'd been leading us there, that they'd wanted us in that city. He glanced around the fire, his gaze settling on Rikton, who looked particularly uneasy. Do you know what it feels like? Darvek asked softly. To be hunted? No one answered. We became prey in our own stronghold, he said, his voice low, measured. The first sign was a silence. No counterattack, no fighting. We thought we'd won. He exhaled through his nose. Then the explosion started. The buildings we'd taken collapsed on top of us. They cut off our escape routes, forced us into kill zones. They moved in the rubble like ghosts, picking us off one by one. Snipers that never missed. Fighters that never tired. We thought we were monsters. We learned what real monsters look like that night. He fell silent for a long moment. The city burned for 3 days. He finally said, voice distant, "We didn't win. We didn't survive. We escaped, and I left half my men buried in that place." The young warriors were rigid now, staring into the fire as if afraid of what they might see reflected there. The night felt colder, the wind sharper. Darvek's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "You laugh at humans because you do not understand them," he said. "You think madness is weakness. But I tell you now, humans are not weak, and their madness is not a failing. It is their greatest strength." A hush fell over the camp, thick as smoke. Darvek's dark gaze swept over them once more. "The first time you face them in battle, you will understand. When you see one of them stand when no living being should, when you watch a human bleed and grin at you, when you hear them laugh in the face of death, you will understand." The recruits sat in tense silence, the fire crackling in the quiet. "And if you're very, very lucky," Darvek murmured, "you will live long enough to remember that lesson." The wind howled to the emptiness around them, carrying the weight of unspoken fears into the endless night. The fire had burned low, casting faint orange light on the stone beneath it. The young Dravari recruits sat in silence, no longer scoffing, no longer speaking over one another in their previous bravado. The weight of Darvek's words pressed down on them like the cold night air. He had spoken of human bravery, of their madness, of the way they fought without surrender, without fear. But even as the recruits tried to grasp what he had told them, they sensed there was more, a deeper, stranger truth that had yet to be spoken. Darvek sat still, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze distant as if looking past the fire, past the recruits, past the world itself. Zilvas, who had been the most vocal before, swallowed before breaking the silence. "You say they're ruthless," he said, voice quieter than before, "that they fight like beasts when cornered, that they don't stop, that they laugh in the face of death." His claws dug absently into the dirt. "Then why do the elders call them something else? Why do they speak of their compassion, their mercy?" Darvek blinked slowly, as if roused from another place, another time. He nodded, as if he had expected the question. "Because they are something more than just warriors," he said. "And that is what makes them even more terrifying." The recruits exchanged uneasy glances. Compassion, mercy, these were things that had no place in war. And yet, Darvek was looking at them with something unreadable in his dark eyes. "I told you how we lost the battle for Vasker, Seven," he continued. "How we were driven from that cursed world. What I didn't tell you was what happened after." The embers crackled softly. "I was left behind." The recruits looked at him sharply. Being left behind on an enemy-controlled world meant only one thing: death. "I was injured," Darvek said, his voice steady. "I should have died there, like the others. Our retreat had been chaotic. The battle lost so suddenly that we left behind more than our dead. The humans hunted us as we fled, but I was already down when they arrived." His gaze flickered toward the fire. "I remember the pain. The ground was wet beneath me, not with rain, but with blood, some mine, some not. I couldn't move, could barely breathe. A long pause. And then," he said, "a shadow fell over me." The recruits leaned forward, instinctively wary. "I thought it was one of my own, come to finish me out of mercy. But it wasn't." Darvek's fingers curled slightly. It was a human. He was bloodied, limping, his rifle slung across his back. Sergeant Lewis Carter. The name meant nothing to the recruits, but the way Darvek said it, the way the syllables lingered in the air, gave it weight. "He could have killed me," Darvek said. "He should have. I had killed his kind. I had led the charge against his forces, ordered the deaths of his people. I had given him every reason to let me bleed out in the dirt." The fire flickered. The recruits watched him intently, but he didn't. Darvek's voice was quieter now. Instead, he knelt beside me, pulled something from his pack. It took me a moment to realize what he was doing. He exhaled, the memory washing over him. He was binding my wounds. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the recruits. Zilvas stiffened. Rikton frowned deeply, his talons flexing. "I couldn't understand it either," Darvek admitted, "even as I felt the bandages tighten around my side, even as he staunched the wound that should have killed me. I couldn't grasp it." His voice dropped. I looked up at him and asked, "Why?" The recruits held their breath. Carter had merely looked at him, eyes weary but unwavering. And then, in his strange, broken way, he had smiled. "Not all fights have to end in death," he had said. Darvek stared into the fire. That was the first time I had ever heard those words. Silence. The wind swept through the darkness beyond the fire, rattling the rocks at the camp's edge. The recruits looked at each other, at Darvek, at the fire, as if searching for answers that would make the story make sense. But they found none. "He carried me," Darvek continued, voice distant. "A Dravari warrior. His enemy. He slung my arm over his shoulder and half-dragged, half-carried me back to their medical post." The firelight flickered over the recruits' expressions, shock, disbelief, quiet horror. I was taken to a human medical tent, surrounded by those I had fought to destroy. I thought I would be executed. I thought I would be dissected, studied like some strange specimen. Darvek's lip curled slightly. Instead, they treated my wounds. They fed me. His gaze flicked to the younger soldiers, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. Have you ever been given food by an enemy? Have you ever had the ones you sought to kill offer you water, while their own still lay dying outside? No one answered. They should have let me die, he said softly. But they didn't. And I learned something that I had never been taught in all my years as a warrior. The flame shifted, casting deep shadows across his face. Humans do not only fight with rage. They fight with purpose. And when they choose to save instead of kill, that choice is more powerful than any weapon I have ever seen. The words settled heavily around them. They are not weak because they show mercy, Darvek said. They are strong because they can, because they choose to, even when it makes no sense, even when the ones they save would have never done the same for them. The young warriors were silent now, their eyes reflecting the flickering light, their expressions unreadable. They do not fear pain the way we do, Darvek continued. They do not even fear death the way we do. But more than that, they do not let war consume what makes them who they are. He paused, then let out a slow breath. And that is why we lost. Zilvas looked up at him, his throat tight. Because they saved you? Darvek gave the faintest shake of his head. No, he said. Because they saved each other. A hush fell over the camp. The wind carried the distant echoes of the past across the ruined land, whispering through the remains of old battles long since fought. Darvek let the silence settle before speaking again. You think humans are dangerous because they refuse to die, he said. But tell me, what is more terrifying? A soldier who will fight to his last breath, or one who will fight to his last breath to save another? No one spoke. No one moved. That, Darvek said, voice steady, final, is why they will always be stronger than us. The fire burned lower. The night stretched long and silent, and none of them could look away. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing like the last breath of a dying sun. The night stretched deep and vast beyond the encampment, swallowing sound, swallowing warmth. The young Dravari recruits sat unmoving, the weight of Darvek's words pressing into their bones. His stories had stolen something from them, their certainty, their arrogance, their ignorance. No one mocked humans now. Zilvas shifted, his talons idly scraping against the stone beneath him. His throat felt dry, his mind thick with unanswered questions. For the first time in his young life, he felt something he did not recognize. It took him a moment to name it. Doubt. Captain, he said finally, his voice quieter than before. Do you... The warning sirens shrieked through the night. Every recruit shot to their feet, instincts burning away the haze of contemplation. The air shifted, suddenly electric, humming with a tension that sent a shiver through the camp. The motion sensors had triggered. Something was out there, moving in the dark beyond the fire's glow. Weapons were drawn in a flash, plasma rifles humming G to life with a low, lethal thrum. Clawed fingers tightened around grips, bodies tensed, eyes darting through the shadows. Dravari did not panic. Dravari were warriors. But this was no ordinary drill. Rikton turned toward Darvek, who had not moved. The old warrior sat as still as stone, his dark eyes fixed on the black horizon beyond the ridge. What is it? Rikton asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Darvek's jaw tightened slightly. Trouble. A distant sound, metal on rock. Slow. Purposeful. The sound of something walking, something heavy, something deliberate. It wasn't the erratic movement of a wild animal. It wasn't the stumbling gait of wounded prey. It was something else. The sentries posted at the perimeter should have called in by now. They hadn't. A shape emerged from the darkness. It was alone, walking straight toward the fire, toward them. The young warriors lifted their rifles as one, the circle tightening, but Darvek raised a hand, stopping them. His face had changed. The hardened lines of a warrior's mask were there, but beneath them, something flickered, something almost like recognition. The figure stepped into the light. It was a man, a human. Zilvas inhaled sharply, fingers twitching on the trigger of his weapon. The human was older, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long, tattered military coat that had seen too many battles. His hair was streaked with gray, his jaw lined with scars. He carried a rifle slung over one shoulder, but he made no move to draw it. He stopped a few paces from the fire. His eyes, dark, knowing, steady, swept over the group of young warriors before settling on Darvek. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, the human exhaled through his nose. Well, he said, voice rough but amused. Still breathing, Darvek? The tension shattered like brittle glass. Darvek let out a slow breath, his lips curving into something that was not quite a smile. Graves. A murmur rippled through the recruits. Graves. A name, a human name, spoken with familiarity, with acknowledgement. Not as prey, not as an enemy, as something else. Captain Daniel Graves tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the group. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about him. Something coiled, something dangerous in its ease. The recruits had seen predators before, but never one that smiled. Didn't think I'd run into you out here, Graves said, stepping forward, closer to the fire. Figured you'd be too smart to babysit hatchlings. His eyes flicked to the younger warriors, his mouth quirking slightly. Unless things have really gone downhill for you. A few of the recruits bristled at the insult, but none spoke. They had heard too much of what humans were. And this one walked without fear into a circle of armed warriors. Darvek exhaled, shaking his head. I thought you were dead. Yeah, Graves said, rubbing at his jaw. I hear that a lot. Zilvas finally found his voice, though it was quieter than he intended. You know each other? Graves turned his gaze to him, the firelight flickering in his dark eyes. Kid, I know Darvek better than most of your own kind do. He nodded toward the veteran. We spent a good few years trying to kill each other before we figured out it wasn't worth the effort. Rickton frowned. You were enemies. Graves shrugged. Only until we weren't. No one knew what to make of that. The human crouched near the fire, resting his elbows on his knees, his movements slow, measured, utterly unafraid. You telling them stories, Darvek? Graves asked, smirking. Teaching them not to poke the wrong bear? Darvek grunted. Something like that. The recruits watched the exchange in silence, confusion mixing with unease. This was not how it was supposed to go. Humans were supposed to be the enemy. They were not supposed to sit by the fire with Dravari warriors. They were not supposed to speak like old friends. Zilvas stared at the human, his mind churning with everything he had learned that night. His claws twitched at his sides, frustration bubbling beneath his skin. I don't understand, he admitted. Everything we've been taught, everything we believed. It says you should hate each other. Graves exhaled, his expression shifting just slightly. Something thoughtful, something almost distant. He plucked a loose ember from the fire with gloved fingers, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger before letting it drop. Hate's easy, he said finally. Doesn't take much effort. Doesn't take much thought. It's simple. Too simple. He met Zilvas's eyes, his expression unreadable. Understanding? That's the hard part. No one spoke. Graves tilted his head toward Darvek. He ever tell you about the time I pulled him out of a burning transport while his own men were leaving him for dead? A flicker of something passed over Darvek's face. Not embarrassment. Something older, something deeper. You never let that go, the Dravari muttered. Not a chance, Graves said, grinning. The recruits had no words. Everything they had believed about war, about enemies, about humans, it all cracked under the weight of the reality sitting before them. Graves let out a slow breath, rising to his feet, his coat shifting around him. He rolled his shoulders, his body moving like a man who had seen too many wars and carried them all with him. Well, he said, I should get going before I give these kids nightmares. He nodded toward Darvek. Try not to die before I see you again. Darvek's expression was unreadable. I make no promises. Graves smirked, and then, with the same ease with which he had arrived, the human turned and walked back into the darkness. No rush, no hesitation, no fear. The recruits watched until he was gone, until the night swallowed him whole. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Darvek exhaled, his voice quiet. Do you understand now? The fire crackled, the wind howled, and no one, not even Zilvas, had an answer.